Hey friend, welcome to Sleepy History World. Before we begin tonight, if this channel becomes a place you enjoy returning to, and these slow, quiet stories help make your nights a little more peaceful, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and lets you find your way back whenever you are ready for another journey into the past. Now settle in, get comfortable, and imagine opening your eyes in the 1800s on the morning after your wedding. The person sleeping beside you may be someone you deeply love, or someone you barely had the chance to truly know. There are no text messages, no quick phone calls, and for many couples, no easy way to simply walk away if the marriage goes wrong. Your money, your home, your children, your reputation, and sometimes even your legal identity can now depend on this one relationship. Behind the elegant wedding portraits and carefully written love letters was a world of exhausting household work, dangerous childbirth, financial uncertainty, strict expectations, quiet arguments, surprising tenderness, and marriages that could last for decades. Some couples became inseparable, others lived like strangers beneath the same roof. And tonight, as we move slowly through their homes, letters, routines, and private struggles, we'll discover what it was really like to be married in the 1800s. Imagine waking up in the 19th century and realizing that marriage was not simply a private relationship between two people who loved each other. It was a social institution that could determine where you lived, how you worked, what happened to your money, how many children you might have, and in many places, especially for women, how much control you had over your own life. The 1800s covered an enormous range of cultures, classes, and countries. So there was never one universal experience of marriage. A wealthy couple living in London experienced married life very differently from farmers in rural America, factory workers in Manchester, settlers on the frontier, or families living elsewhere in Europe and the wider world. Yet across much of Britain and the United States, marriage carried expectations that would feel surprisingly strict to many people today. Romantic love certainly existed. People wrote passionate letters, missed their spouses when separated, celebrated anniversaries, argued, reconciled, laughed together, and sometimes built deeply affectionate partnerships. But marriage was also about survival, property, family reputation, labor, inheritance, religion, and social stability. Choosing the wrong spouse could affect almost every part of your future, and leaving an unhappy marriage was often far more difficult than entering one. For many young people, the path toward marriage began under the watchful eyes of family and community. Dating as we understand it today did not really exist in the same form. Courtship was usually more structured, particularly among respectable middle and upper-class families. A young man might visit a woman's home, speak with her, while relatives were nearby, accompany her to church or social gatherings, exchange letters, or gradually make his intentions known. Privacy could be limited because reputation mattered enormously. A woman who appeared too eager, spent too much time alone with a man, or became involved in a public scandal, could face consequences extending far beyond embarrassment. Her reputation might affect future marriage prospects, and even the standing of her family. Men were generally permitted greater freedom, although class, religion, family expectations, and financial circumstances could restrict them as well. Marriage was rarely regarded as a decision affecting only two individuals. Families wanted to know whether a prospective husband could provide an income, whether a prospective wife came from a respectable household, whether the match was socially appropriate, and sometimes whether property, business interests, or inheritance made the union desirable. Money quietly influenced countless marriages. A man might sincerely love a woman and still be expected to postpone marriage until he could support a household. A woman might care deeply for a man yet understand that marrying someone without reliable income could mean years of insecurity. Among wealthy families, property and inheritance could become even more important. Marriage settlements, dowries, land, businesses, and family fortunes could shape negotiations surrounding a match among poorer families. There might be little property to negotiate, but economic reality was just as powerful. A household needed food, fuel, clothing, rent, and labor. Marriage created an economic partnership, even when society did not describe it in those terms. Husbands and wives frequently depended on one another's work, simply to keep the family functioning. The romantic image of a husband earning all the money while his wife remained comfortably at home applied much more easily to certain middle-class ideals than to the lives of millions of ordinary families. Once married, the legal situation could change dramatically, particularly for women. In 19th century Britain and the United States, laws varied by place and changed substantially over the century. But the doctrine of coverture had a profound influence on married women's legal status in the Anglo-American world. Under traditional coverture, a married woman's independent legal identity was heavily restricted because husband and wife were treated in many legal contexts as a single unit represented by the husband. Property that a woman brought into marriage could come under her husband's control, and her ability to enter contracts, control wages, or independently conduct certain legal affairs could be limited. The exact rules were complicated, and exceptions existed, especially through trusts, marriage settlements, and local laws. But the underlying imbalance was real during the 19th century. Reform movements gradually challenged these restrictions. Married women's property laws began allowing women in various jurisdictions to own and control property more independently. The changes did not happen everywhere at once, and equality was far from complete. But by the end of the century, the legal landscape had shifted considerably from what couples at the beginning of the 1800s had known. Daily married life was shaped less by romantic speeches than by relentless work. Before electric washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, supermarkets, central heating, and countless other conveniences, maintaining a household required enormous physical effort. Water might need to be carried or pumped. Fires needed to be started, maintained, and cleaned. Food had to be purchased, grown, preserved, prepared, and cooked, using equipment that demanded constant attention. Clothes required washing by hand, drying, ironing, repairing, and sometimes making from scratch. Floors had to be swept and scrubbed, lamps cleaned and filled, candles managed, bedding aired, and household supplies carefully rationed. In rural families, domestic responsibilities could exist alongside gardening, preserving food, tending poultry, caring for dairy animals, helping during harvests, or participating in family businesses. The boundaries between housework and economically productive work were often far less clear than later stereotypes suggest. For husbands, marriage also brought heavy expectations. A respectable man was often judged by his ability to provide for his household and exercise responsibility over his family. Failure could carry intense shame. Employment in the 19th century was frequently unstable and dangerous. Men worked in mines, factories, docks, farms, construction sites, workshops, railways, ships, offices, shops, and countless trades. Industrial accidents were common. Labour protections were limited by modern standards, and an injury could suddenly destroy a family's income. There was no broad modern welfare system waiting to replace a lost wage. Savings, relatives, churches, charitable organisations, friendly societies, or local poor relief might provide assistance. But many families lived dangerously close to poverty. A husband leaving home for work was therefore doing more than following a social convention. His wages could determine whether the household ate properly that week. For working-class wives, the idea that marriage meant withdrawing completely from paid labour was often unrealistic. Married women took in laundry, sewed clothing, worked as domestic servants, sold goods, kept lodgers, helped run shops, performed agricultural labour, worked in factories, or earned money through informal occupations that were not always carefully recorded. Some performed paid work from inside their homes while simultaneously caring for children. Their contribution could be essential, even if contemporary society continued to describe the husband as the household's provider. Marriage for these couples was frequently an exhausting collaboration in which both partners worked, though their labour was valued differently and their legal power remained unequal. Then there were children in an age before reliable modern contraception. Many married couples faced repeated pregnancies. Family sizes varied enormously, and not every pregnancy resulted in a surviving child. Pregnancy and childbirth carried dangers that modern medicine has greatly reduced. Doctors and midwives possessed far fewer tools for dealing with hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labour, and other complications. Germ theory and antiseptic practices developed during the century, but medical improvements arrived unevenly. A woman could enter labour knowing that childbirth was an ordinary part of married life, while also understanding that women sometimes died from it. Husbands, too, could experience the frightening uncertainty of waiting while a wife endured a difficult delivery with limited medical assistance. Infant and childhood mortality added another emotional burden. Parents in the 19th century were familiar with death in ways many modern families are fortunate not to be. Disease could move rapidly through a household. Measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, and other illnesses could devastate families. Losing a child was not necessarily easier simply because childhood death was more common. Diaries, letters, mourning customs, photographs, and memorials reveal profound grief. A married couple might celebrate the birth of several children and bury one or more of them before adulthood. They might also lose parents, siblings, friends, or spouses at comparatively young ages. Marriage therefore existed, alongside a constant awareness that family life could change suddenly. The emotional relationship between husbands and wives is harder to reconstruct because private feelings were not always recorded. Surviving letters show tremendous variety. Some marriages were affectionate and playful. Couples used pet names, shared jokes, worried about each other's health, discussed children, exchanged news, and expressed genuine longing when separated. Husbands travelling for work sometimes wrote home almost daily. And when morning arrived, marriage became practical again, almost immediately. there was rarely much time for the leisurely domestic life shown in later paintings and nostalgic films. In many households, especially those belonging to farmers, labourers, tradespeople, and working families, both husband and wife woke with responsibilities already waiting for them. A fire that had gone cold during the night needed to be revived. Water might have to be fetched or pumped. Children needed washing, dressing, feeding, and supervising. Animals required attention. Breakfast had to be prepared from ingredients that demanded considerably more work than opening a package or turning on an appliance. Before one ordinary 19th century family had properly begun its day, someone might already have carried water, chopped or collected fuel, cleaned ashes from a stove or fireplace, prepared food, emptied chamber pots, and dealt with a crying child. Marriage was experienced through these repetitive tasks as much as through weddings, anniversaries, or declarations of affection. The husband might then disappear into a completely different world for much of the day. In an industrial city, he could spend 10 or 12 hours inside a factory, workshop, warehouse, dockyard, mine, or railway environment. In rural areas, husband and wife might remain physically closer while performing different parts of the same agricultural work. Shopkeepers sometimes lived directly above or behind their businesses, making the separation between family life and employment almost non-existent. Craftsmen might work from home. Farmers could have children and spouses helping around them. The familiar modern pattern in which one partner drives away to an office and returns at a predictable hour would have seemed remarkably comfortable to many 19th century workers. Predictability itself was valuable. A household with a reliable income had something worth protecting. There were periods during the 19th century when economic downturns, harvest failures, industrial changes, or unemployment placed enormous pressure on families. If wages stopped, bills did not. Food still had to be purchased. Rent still had to be paid. Children continued growing out of their clothes. Winter still arrived and demanded fuel. Families sometimes pawned possessions temporarily to survive difficult weeks. Clothing, tools, furniture, and household objects could become emergency sources of cash. A wedding ring, or treasured object, might represent sentiment. But when a family was hungry, sentiment competed with necessity. This financial vulnerability influenced the emotional atmosphere of marriage. A husband who could not find work might feel that he had failed in the role society expected him to perform. A wife trying to stretch inadequate wages could become responsible for making impossible calculations. Which bill could wait? How much meat could the household afford? Could an old dress be repaired again? Could another child be accommodated? Would a landlord tolerate late rent? Financial disagreements were not invented by modern couples. They were simply conducted without credit cards, online banking, social security systems, or many of the financial protections that exist today. For women managing households, thrift could become almost a profession. Nothing useful was casually wasted. Leftover food could be transformed into another meal. Fabric from old clothing might become children's garments, patches, cleaning cloths, or household items. Bones could be used for stock, fat could be saved, jars and containers were reused. Clothing was repaired repeatedly. A skilled household manager knew how to make limited resources last. Middle-class advice books often presented household management as a moral responsibility. praising women who maintained orderly homes without excessive spending. Behind the elegant language was a simple reality. Poor management could have serious consequences. Marriage also meant learning another person's habits with very little opportunity to escape them. Courtship offered only a partial view of someone's personality. A carefully dressed young man speaking politely in a parlour might behave quite differently after several years of financial stress and sleepless children. A woman admired for her beauty and manners during courtship might turn out to have ambitions, opinions, anxieties, or habits her husband had never understood. Couples discovered one another slowly after the marriage had already become legally and socially difficult to undo. This could produce tenderness, frustration, or both. Perhaps one spouse snored loudly. Perhaps another spent too much money. One might dislike the other's relatives. One might be unusually tidy, while the other left belongings everywhere. A husband could return from work wanting silence, while his wife, after spending the entire day surrounded by children, desperately wanted adult conversation. A wife might expect her husband to notice something that needed repairing while he assumed she would simply ask. These tiny disagreements rarely appear in official historical records, yet they probably occupied more of married life than the grand political events occurring outside the front door. The presence of extended family could make everything more complicated. Marriage often connected not merely two individuals, but two networks of relatives. Parents might provide money, housing, childcare, employment, land, or advice. They could also interfere. A mother-in-law might have strong opinions about how children should be raised. A father might believe his daughter's husband was financially irresponsible. Siblings could borrow money and fail to repay it. Elderly parents might eventually move into the household and require care. In communities where families remained geographically close, relatives could be involved in everyday life to a degree that some modern couples would find overwhelming. For a newly married woman, entering her husband's family could be particularly intimidating. She might leave the household in which she had grown up and move into unfamiliar surroundings where expectations were already established. If she married a farmer, she might enter a household where her mother-in-law had managed domestic routines for decades. If she married into a business family, she might be expected to assist in the shop. If she moved far away, letters might become her only connection with parents and siblings. Homesickness did not disappear simply because marriage was considered an adult responsibility. Moving after marriage could be dramatic. During the 19th century, millions of people migrated within countries and across oceans. Couples left villages for rapidly growing industrial cities. Europeans crossed the Atlantic to North America. Families moved westward across the United States. Others migrated throughout expanding colonial and commercial networks. A newly married couple could find themselves hundreds or thousands of miles from everyone they had known. The promise of land, employment, or opportunity competed with loneliness and uncertainty. Imagine arriving in a settlement where your nearest trusted relative lived weeks away. There was no video call home, no inexpensive flight back for Christmas, and perhaps no reliable postal connection. A letter became a physical piece of home. People preserved correspondence because handwriting itself carried emotional weight. The page had been touched by someone they loved. A wife could read the same letter repeatedly while waiting months for another. A husband working far away might keep his wife's letter folded in a pocket until the paper softened at the creases. Distance also created uncertainty that modern communication has largely eliminated. Silence could mean almost anything. Perhaps a letter had been delayed. Perhaps someone was ill. Perhaps a ship was late. Perhaps bad weather had interrupted transportation. Or perhaps something terrible had happened. There was often no immediate way to know. News travelled at the speed of horses, ships, trains, and eventually telegraph wires. The telegraph revolutionized long-distance communication during the 19th century. But sending messages cost money and telegrams were generally brief. The intimate daily conversation modern couples can maintain across continents remained impossible. Inside the home, nighttime had its own rhythm. Before widespread electric lighting, evenings were governed by darkness in a way modern people rarely experience. Candles, oil lamps, and gas lighting provided illumination, but light cost money. Families had reasons not to waste it. Evening activities might gather people around a limited source of warmth and brightness. Someone could read aloud while others sewed or repaired clothing. Children completed lessons. A husband might read a newspaper. A wife might write letters or prepare something for the following day. Conversation happened because entertainment options were limited. This did not mean evenings were always peaceful. A small house filled with tired adults and restless children could be noisy and irritating. Winter increased the pressure. Rooms were cold, daylight was short. Washing took longer to dry. Roads became difficult, and illness spread through crowded households. Couples could spend months in close quarters while worrying about fuel and food. The romantic image of sitting beside a crackling 19th century fireplace ignores the person who had to obtain the fuel, clean the ashes, manage the smoke, and wake early enough to restart the fire. Sleeping arrangements varied enormously. Wealthy husbands and wives might have separate bedrooms if they wished, while poor couples could barely obtain a separate bed from their children. In crowded urban housing, entire families sometimes occupied a single room. There was another side of 19th century marriage that rarely appeared in formal portraits. The enormous amount of adjustment required during the first months of living together. A wedding could be surrounded by ceremony, relatives, food, clothing, religious promises, and public celebration. But when everyone eventually went home, two people were left to construct an ordinary life together. For some couples, this was the first time they had experienced prolonged privacy with one another. Courtship had often taken place under observation, through carefully written letters, family visits, church gatherings, walks, dances, and other respectable social occasions. Marriage removed many of those boundaries almost overnight. The person who had previously appeared in carefully prepared clothing for an afternoon visit was suddenly present at breakfast during illness, in exhaustion, during financial worries, and in all the unpolished moments that courtship had concealed. For a young bride, the transition could be especially dramatic. Depending on her circumstances, marriage might mean leaving the house in which she had spent almost her entire life. The familiar bedroom, neighbourhood, siblings, parents, routines, and friendships of childhood could suddenly be replaced by a new household. Some women moved only a few streets away and remained closely connected to their families. Others moved to another county, another state, or across an ocean. A woman who had never lived independently could find herself expected to manage a household almost immediately, There was no universal handbook that guaranteed success. Advice books certainly existed, and older women passed down knowledge about cooking, cleaning, pregnancy, childcare, household accounts, and dealing with husbands. But actual experience had to be acquired through repetition. A young wife could burn meals, miscalculate expenses, ruin clothing during washing, struggle with a stove, or discover that maintaining a house required far more organization than she had imagined. Wealthier women might have servants performing much of the physical work, but managing servants brought another set of expectations. Hiring, supervising, feeding, correcting, and sometimes dismissing domestic workers could become part of the wife's responsibility. The husband was adjusting too. Marriage could transform him from a single-wage earner responsible, mainly for himself, into someone expected to support another adult, and soon enough possibly several children. Even men who wanted marriage could feel the weight of this transition. A careless purchase that once affected only him now reduced the household budget. Losing employment no longer meant simply finding another job eventually. It could mean watching a wife and children go without necessities. The pressure to appear respectable could make these struggles harder. 19th century communities were often intensely observant. Neighbors noticed who visited whom, whose children were badly dressed, who purchased goods on credit, who argued loudly, who attended church, whose husband came home drunk, and whose household appeared unusually prosperous. Privacy existed, but reputation lived partly in the opinions of other people. For middle-class couples especially, the appearance of domestic stability could become important. A clean home, well-behaved children, properly prepared meals, appropriate clothing, and polite hospitality communicated respectability. Visitors entering a parlour saw the carefully maintained public face of the family. They did not necessarily see the unpaid bills hidden in a drawer, the argument that had occurred the previous evening, or the exhausted wife repairing clothes late at night. Keeping up appearances could therefore become a form of labour. Clothing had to be appropriate even when money was tight. Guests might need to be offered refreshments. Children had to behave correctly in public. A husband's professional reputation could even be influenced by his domestic circumstances, because a stable household suggested reliability and moral character. For poorer couples, there was often less ability to conceal hardship. Crowded housing placed family life close to neighbours. Thin walls carried arguments and crying children. Shared courtyards, pumps, staircases, washing areas, and toilets meant that domestic life unfolded partly in public. A family's poverty was difficult to hide when clothing was visibly worn or children lacked shoes. Yet these same communities could provide essential support. Neighbours watched children, shared food, lent household objects, assisted during childbirth, sat beside the sick, and helped prepare bodies after death. Marriage did not exist in isolation. A couple belonged to a network of relationships that could become crucial during emergencies. Women in particular often built strong networks with other women. Mothers, sisters, neighbours, friends, midwives, and female relatives exchanged knowledge that husbands might barely encounter. Pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, menstruation, childcare, illness, cooking, preserving food, and household remedies created a world of practical knowledge passed through conversation and experience. For a husband, Social life might revolve more heavily around employment, religious organizations, clubs, taverns, political groups, trade associations, or other male spaces. This separation could create two partially different worlds within the same marriage. Husband and wife might spend most of the day among entirely different people, and then exchange information in the evening. The amount couples actually talked about their emotions probably varied as much as it does today. Some 19th century letters reveal remarkable openness. Spouses confessed loneliness, jealousy, anxiety, affection, frustration, and fear. Others communicated in a restrained style that can sound almost businesslike. Cultural expectations encouraged emotional self-control, particularly in certain social classes, but formal language should not automatically be mistaken for emotional distance. Sometimes affection appeared through actions rather than declarations. A husband could walk miles to obtain medicine for his sick wife. A wife might remain awake through the night, nursing her husband through fever. A spouse could quietly save money to purchase something the other needed. During periods of scarcity, adults sometimes reduced their own food so children could eat. Illness tested marriages repeatedly. Before antibiotics, illnesses that seem manageable today could become prolonged household crises. Someone with pneumonia, tuberculosis, severe influenza, infected wounds, or gastrointestinal disease might require weeks of care. Hospitals were not automatically the normal destination for every sick person. Much treatment occurred at home, placing nursing responsibilities largely on relatives. A wife often became the household nurse regardless of whether she possessed medical training. She changed bedding, prepared food, administered remedies, cleaned wounds, monitored fever, and sat beside sick children or a husband. If she became ill herself, the entire domestic system could falter because so many routines depended upon her labor. Husbands could also become caregivers, especially when wives experienced difficult pregnancies, chronic illness, or recovery from childbirth. Private letters occasionally reveal men performing tasks that public gender ideals might have described as feminine simply because someone had to do them. Real life had a way of disrupting neat social categories. Medicine itself could be uncertain. Families used physicians when available and affordable, but they also relied on home remedies, patent medicines, herbal preparations, advice from neighbors, and treatments passed down through families. Some remedies were harmless, some useful, and others ineffective or dangerous. The 19th century witnessed enormous advances in medical understanding, but ordinary families lived through the transition rather than receiving modern medicine all at once. A doctor summoned to a sick household might arrive by horse after a considerable delay. Rural isolation could make professional medical help difficult to obtain. During emergencies, spouses sometimes had to make decisions themselves while waiting. Imagine watching the person you married struggle to breathe, while knowing that the nearest physician was miles away and there was no telephone to call for immediate advice. Fear could become part of domestic life without being openly discussed. A pregnant woman might remember a sister or neighbor who died during childbirth. A husband working in a mine might know men killed underground. A family living during a disease outbreak might watch houses nearby become infected one after another. Marriage offered companionship against these fears, but it could also create new fears because loving someone meant having someone to lose. The possibility of losing a spouse made financial planning important for families who had enough income to plan at all. Life insurance expanded during the 19th century, particularly among middle-class households. A husband could pay into a policy intended to protect his wife and children if he died. Friendly societies and mutual aid organizations also provided forms of assistance among working people, but many families remained one accident away from disaster. A broken leg could prevent months of work. A factory closing could remove wages immediately. A landlord might not care that a child was sick. Marriage could therefore feel like an economic balancing act in which one unexpected event threatened years of careful effort. Debt was deeply stressful. Credit existed in many forms, from shopkeepers allowing regular customers to pay later to formal loans and mortgages. Families could accumulate obligations gradually. One of the most revealing things about 19th century marriage was how much could remain unknown about a future spouse until the wedding was already over. Courtship might last months, or even years, but it still took place within social boundaries designed to protect reputation. Couples could talk, exchange letters, attend gatherings, walk together, and gradually become emotionally close. Yet there were parts of one another's personalities that were difficult to discover under such controlled circumstances. A young woman might know that her future husband was considered respectable, that he had reliable employment, that his family approved of the match, and that he behaved politely in company. She could not necessarily know what he would be like after losing money, after drinking too much, after becoming exhausted, or after discovering that married life was more expensive than expected. A young man could admire a woman's appearance, manners, education, and domestic abilities without understanding how she would respond to loneliness, pregnancy, financial pressure, or the responsibilities of managing a household. Marriage was therefore a leap into the unknown in a way modern couples who live together or spend years dating might find difficult to imagine. Letters offered one of the few places where couples could become more emotionally open before marriage. 19th century courtship letters could contain extraordinary intensity. People described how often they thought about one another, worried when replies were delayed, apologized for misunderstandings, discussed future homes, and occasionally expressed jealousy about other potential admirers. Waiting for a letter created an emotional rhythm that has almost disappeared in an age of instant communication. If someone wrote on Monday, there might be no response until days later. A poorly chosen sentence could cause anxiety for an entire week because there was no immediate way to clarify it. The physical letter itself mattered. Handwriting revealed haste, confidence, nervousness, or fatigue. Paper could carry traces of the person who had handled it. Letters were folded carefully and stored in boxes, drawers, trunks, or tied bundles. Some survived for generations precisely because descendants understood that these pieces of paper contained the private beginnings of marriages they had only known in their mature form. A proposal of marriage also carried more practical weight than the romantic moment emphasized in modern storytelling. A man proposing was effectively saying that he believed he could establish or maintain a household. A woman accepting was often agreeing not simply to love him, but to connect her economic and legal future with his. Depending on the family, conversations about money, property, housing, and parental approval might follow or precede the proposal. Engagement did not necessarily mean immediate marriage. Couples sometimes waited while a man saved money, secured employment, completed professional training, obtained family approval, or prepared accommodation, Long engagements could be emotionally difficult. A couple might already think of themselves as belonging together while remaining unable to establish a household. For poorer couples, the obstacle was often painfully simple. Marriage cost money because maintaining a home cost money. Even when the wedding itself was modest, rent, furniture, cooking equipment, bedding, clothing, and food required resources. Some couples began with very little and depended on gifts or second-hand household goods from relatives. Wedding gifts could therefore be extremely practical. Bedding, linens, dishes, cookware, furniture, and household textiles helped create the infrastructure of married life. What appears unromantic from a modern perspective could be deeply valuable to a couple beginning with limited resources. A set of sheets or cooking pots could matter more than a decorative luxury. After the ceremony, expectations changed immediately. Behaviors that had been carefully supervised during courtship became ordinary parts of private life. Husband and wife shared physical space, finances, responsibilities, and increasingly intimate knowledge of one another. For some brides, the wedding night could be frightening. Sexual education for respectable young women was often limited, inconsistent, or deliberately vague. Mothers might offer advice before marriage, but the amount and accuracy varied enormously. Some women undoubtedly entered marriage understanding reproduction reasonably well. Others possessed only fragments of information. Men were more likely to have been permitted access to sexual knowledge, though this did not guarantee accurate understanding or considerate behavior. Medical beliefs surrounding sexuality could be contradictory, moralistic, and sometimes simply wrong. Marriage therefore required couples to navigate intimacy within a culture that frequently discouraged open discussion of it. Yet 19th century husbands and wives were not emotionally or sexually blank, simply because public language was restrained. Private diaries, letters, court records, medical literature, and family sizes make clear that intimacy was an important part of marriage. Couples experienced desire and attraction. Some clearly enjoyed physical affection. Others experienced mismatched expectations, fear, disappointment, coercion, or emotional distance. The absence of reliable and universally accessible contraception had enormous consequences. Every sexual relationship between a fertile husband and wife could carry the possibility of pregnancy. Various contraceptive practices existed, including withdrawal, abstinence, barrier methods, and other techniques, but knowledge, availability, effectiveness, legality, and social acceptance varied. For many couples, controlling family size therefore remained uncertain. A wife who already had several young children might discover she was pregnant again. The news could produce joy, worry, resignation, or all three at once. Another child meant another birth to survive, another mouth to feed, more washing, more clothing, and several more years of intensive care. Husbands were not unaffected by this arithmetic. A man earning a fixed wage could watch his family expand faster than his income. A household with 2 children might manage comfortably, while a household with 7 could struggle. Parents could love every child while simultaneously fearing the financial consequences of another pregnancy. The emotional complexity of parenthood rarely fits the cheerful family portraits left from the period. Parents could feel exhausted and frustrated. Babies cried for hours. Toddlers broke things. Older children disobeyed. Teenagers challenged authority. Brothers and sisters fought. Parents worried about schooling, employment, morality, friendships, and future marriages. A husband, returning after a long day of work, did not necessarily enter a peaceful domestic sanctuary. He might walk into a room containing a crying infant, 2 arguing children, a tired wife, an unfinished meal, wet laundry, and news that another household expense had appeared. The idealized Victorian home was supposed to offer refuge from the competitive outside world. Reality sometimes offered chaos. This gap between ideal and reality could create guilt. Advice literature often described what respectable husbands and wives should be. A wife was expected to maintain order, create comfort, manage expenses, guide children morally, and support her husband. A husband was expected to provide, protect, exercise judgment, and represent the family in public affairs. But what happened when neither person could meet the ideal? A wife could spend the entire day working and still have a disorderly home. A husband could work honestly and still fail to earn enough. Children could behave badly despite careful parenting. Illness could destroy routines. Economic downturns could make thrift meaningless because there simply was not enough money. Couples sometimes blamed themselves for circumstances produced by the larger society around them. Industrial workers had little control over wages. Families living in overcrowded neighborhoods could not create perfect sanitary conditions. Women managing households could not prevent every infectious disease. Sanitation was particularly important. During much of the 19th century, rapidly growing cities struggled with sewage, contaminated water, overcrowding, and waste. A married couple could maintain their own room carefully and still live beside environmental conditions capable of spreading disease. Cholera outbreaks demonstrated this terrifying vulnerability. A healthy family could become sick rapidly after consuming contaminated water. Before the mechanisms of transmission were fully understood, people could interpret epidemics through competing medical theories, religious explanations, or rumors. During such outbreaks, marriage could become a partnership in fear. Should the family leave the city if they could afford to? Was the neighborhood safe? Was the water dangerous? Should children be sent to relatives? What happened if the husband had to continue working in an affected area? Similar questions appeared during other crises. War-separated couples, economic depressions destroyed employment, crop failures damaged rural households. Fires could consume entire neighborhoods built from combustible materials. There was no insurance against every disaster. Families accumulated possessions slowly and could lose them in hours. A house fire was particularly devastating because the home contained not merely furniture, but the physical record of a marriage, letters, photographs, clothing, wedding gifts, documents, children's objects, inherited possessions, and savings, sometimes kept in cash. Starting again required extraordinary resilience. There was also a quiet reality beneath 19th century marriage that is easy to overlook. Husbands and wives were constantly learning things about each other that no courtship could have revealed. Years had a way of exposing personality. A person who appeared confident before marriage might turn out to be deeply anxious about money. Someone who seemed reserved could become surprisingly affectionate in private. A husband who imagined himself naturally suited to being head of a household might discover that his wife was far better at managing finances than he was. A woman raised to believe that her husband would always know what to do could discover that he was just as uncertain about adulthood as she was. Marriage removed the comfortable illusion that adults automatically understood life. Most couples were improvising. They simply did it in a society that expected them to appear certain. The first serious crisis could therefore become an important moment in a marriage. Perhaps money suddenly disappeared. Perhaps a pregnancy became difficult. Perhaps employment was lost or a parent became seriously ill. The couple who had spent their early months arranging furniture and becoming accustomed to each other's habits suddenly had to make decisions with real consequences. Those moments revealed whether they could cooperate under pressure. Some couples became closer because adversity forced them to trust one another. Others discovered differences that had been invisible during courtship. Money remained one of the most persistent tests because income rarely arrived with the stability many modern salaried workers expect. Agricultural earnings depended upon harvests and prices. Factory employment could fluctuate with demand. Small businesses could lose customers. Craftsmen could become obsolete as industrial production changed markets. Illness could interrupt wages immediately. Even prosperous families could suffer from failed investments or business collapses. For a married couple, financial decline was not simply a matter of having less money. It could mean losing social position. A middle-class family might dismiss servants, move into a smaller house, withdraw children from certain schools, sell furniture, reduce entertaining or avoid acquaintances, because maintaining appearances had become impossible. The emotional humiliation could be intense. A wife might secretly repair an old dress so carefully that neighbors would not realize the family could no longer afford new clothing. A husband might continue wearing a respectable coat while worrying that creditors were about to arrive. Children might be told that certain luxuries were unnecessary without being informed that the family was nearly broke. Financial trouble could become a secret shared only by husband and wife. Sometimes that shared secret strengthened their partnership. They reduced expenses together, sold possessions, moved, borrowed from relatives, or began again somewhere cheaper. At other times, secrecy existed inside the marriage itself. A husband could conceal debts because admitting them felt humiliating. A wife could hide small household purchases because she feared criticism. A spouse could lend money to a relative without telling the other. Trust could disappear gradually rather than through one dramatic betrayal. Marriage involved hundreds of small financial decisions, and everyone contained an element of power. Who held the money? Who decided what counted as necessary? Could the wife purchase something without asking? Did the husband hand over his wages or keep part for himself? Was household money considered hers to manage, or merely his money temporarily placed in her hands? The answers differed enormously between families. In many working households, wives became highly skilled financial managers because they handled the daily budget. A husband might bring home wages and give most or all of them to his wife, who then paid rent, purchased food, obtained fuel, clothed children, and tried to preserve something for emergencies. This could give a woman substantial practical authority, even when the law described her position differently. A husband who underestimated the cost of household life might complain that money disappeared too quickly. His wife knew exactly where it had gone. Bread, coal, soap, candles, rent, shoes, milk, repairs, medicine, nothing dramatic, just survival. A single pair of children's shoes could disturb an already narrow budget. Children grew whether the household could afford it or not. Clothing that fit in spring might be useless by winter hand. Me-downs therefore moved through families. An older brother's coat became a younger brother's coat. A sister's dress was altered for another child. Fabric was valuable enough that garments could be repeatedly transformed. Marriage created a miniature economy inside the household, and the wife was often its central administrator. Food occupied another enormous part of this economy. What a family ate depended on income, region, season, class, and access to markets. Wealthy households could enjoy elaborate meals with multiple courses. Poor families relied heavily on inexpensive staples, and whatever could be stretched across several people. The wife responsible for meals had to think ahead constantly. How long would the flour last? Was the meat still safe? Could yesterday's leftovers become today's dinner? Would unexpected visitors need feeding? Could something be preserved before it spoiled? There was no refrigerator quietly protecting food in the corner for most 19th century families. Preservation required knowledge, salting, drying, smoking, pickling, fermenting, bottling, preserving with sugar, and storing food in cool spaces where practical household skills season mattered. A modern shopper can purchase strawberries in winter without thinking about geography. A 19th century household lived much closer to agricultural cycles. Summer abundance had to be prepared for winter scarcity. Marriage therefore involved planning months ahead. A competent household manager understood not merely cooking but storage, preservation, purchasing, seasonality, and waste. Cooking itself demanded patience. Temperature could not always be controlled with the precision of a modern oven. Fires changed. Fuel quality differed. Smoke escaped into rooms. Pots were heavy. The kitchen could become unbearably hot in summer, yet meals appeared every day because someone made them appear. That invisible repetition defined much of married life. A husband might remember the special dinner prepared on an anniversary, while barely noticing the thousands of ordinary meals surrounding it. The same was true of cleaning. Dirt entered 19th century houses constantly. Coal smoke darkened urban environments. Horses filled streets with waste. Unpaved roads created mud and dust. Open fires produced ash and soot. Industrial cities could deposit grime on windows, clothing, and furniture. Keeping a respectable house clean could feel like fighting the environment itself. Women swept, scrubbed, beat carpets, polished surfaces, washed windows, cleaned fireplaces, emptied waste, and aired rooms. Then everyone walked back inside. The process began again. Marriage was filled with jobs that became visible mainly when they were not done. If the fire was burning, nobody discussed it. If the fire went out on a freezing morning, everyone noticed. If clean clothing appeared in drawers, it seemed ordinary. If there were no clean shirts, it became a problem. Domestic labour often disappeared precisely because it succeeded. This could create resentment. A wife could spend 12 hours working inside the home and still hear the question. A husband could spend 12 hours performing exhausting labour outside and feel that nobody understood the pressure of earning enough for everyone. Both could believe their own burden was invisible. That misunderstanding could become one of the oldest arguments in married life. Each person saw the other's results, but not always the process. The husband saw dinner. The wife saw hours of preparation. The wife saw wages. The husband remembered every unpleasant hour required to earn them. A strong marriage could develop when each learned to recognize the other's labor. A difficult marriage could become a competition over who suffered more. Children amplified everything. They created love and purpose, but they also consumed time, food, clothing, space, and emotional energy. A baby did not care whether its father had worked 14 hours. It cried. A toddler did not care whether its mother had been awake half the night. It needed attention. Parents became tired together. That exhaustion could produce arguments over seemingly trivial things. Who was supposed to quiet the child? Who forgot to buy something? Why had the older children not completed their chores? Why was there no money left? The argument might appear to be about a loaf of bread. In reality, it was about 3 years of fatigue. Yet children could also unite couples. A sick child could erase an argument instantly. Parents who had barely spoken all evening might suddenly sit together beside a bed, listening to every breath. The vulnerability of children in the 19th century made these moments especially frightening. A fever could become dangerous quickly. A rash could signal a serious infectious disease. Parents learned to observe symptoms carefully because professional medical help might not arrive immediately. Nighttime illness was particularly frightening. The house became quiet. A lamp burned beside the bed. One parent tried to sleep while the other watched. Then they exchanged places. Outside, there were no ambulances waiting for a telephone. There might not even be a telephone. Even after years together, 19th century marriage could remain a constant negotiation between expectation and reality. Society might have provided husbands and wives with clearly defined ideas about what each person was supposed to do, but real households rarely operated as neatly as advice books suggested. Life interfered, a husband became sick, a wife inherited money, a business failed, a child required unusual care, a relative moved into the house, a family migrated. Suddenly, the division of responsibilities that once seemed obvious had to change. Couples who adapted could discover strengths in one another that convention had never encouraged them to notice. A husband might be considered the official financial authority of the household, yet his wife could possess the sharper understanding of money. She knew exactly how much food cost, which merchant offered better prices, how long the coal would last, and whether the family could afford new shoes before winter. If her husband was sensible, he listened. If he was proud, he might ignore her until the consequences became impossible to deny. The law could assign authority, but it could not guarantee competence. The reverse was equally true in domestic matters. A widower or a husband whose wife became seriously ill could discover just how many tasks had been happening around him without his attention. Meals did not appear automatically. Clothes did not clean themselves. Children did not somehow arrive at the right places wearing appropriate clothing. The household was an interconnected system requiring planning from morning until night, when the person managing that system was suddenly unavailable. The amount of invisible labor became obvious. A husband might initially believe that cooking was simply placing food over heat. Then he discovered that someone had first decided what to purchase, calculated what could be afforded, obtained the ingredients, stored them correctly, prepared them, maintained the fire, coordinated several dishes, served everyone, preserved leftovers, cleaned the equipment, and already begun thinking about tomorrow. The meal itself was only the visible final stage. The same was true of almost every domestic task. A clean shirt represented water, fuel, soap, physical scrubbing, drying time, ironing, folding, and sometimes mending. A warm room represented fuel purchased or gathered, transported, stored, carried inside, burned, and cleaned afterward. A sleeping child represented feeding, washing, comforting, discipline, storytelling, sickness survived, clothing repaired, and countless interruptions. No visitor ever witnessed. Marriage depended upon this invisible infrastructure. When both spouses appreciated it, domestic cooperation could become remarkably effective. When they did not, resentment could accumulate silently. 19th century expectations often encouraged women to absorb frustration rather than openly challenge husbands, particularly in respectable middle-class culture. But private behavior was more complicated, wives argued. They complained, they wrote angry letters, they temporarily returned to parents, they refused requests, they enlisted relatives to pressure husbands, they used whatever influence their circumstances allowed. Some women possessed formidable authority within their households. Children might technically regard the father as head of the family while knowing perfectly well that their mother controlled the daily machinery of life. A father could issue a grand instruction at breakfast and leave for work. The mother decided how it would actually happen. This informal power could coexist with profound legal inequality. That distinction matters because 19th century women were neither universally powerless nor legally equal. Their influence depended heavily upon class, personality, family support, property, local law, and the character of the men they married. A woman with money inherited through arrangements protecting it from her husband occupied a different position from a factory worker's wife dependent upon weekly wages. A woman with supportive parents nearby had options unavailable to an isolated migrant. A confident, educated wife married to a cooperative husband could participate extensively in decisions. Another woman might need permission for the smallest expense. Both were 19th century wives. Marriage could never be separated from class. Consider the morning of a wealthy wife in a large household. She might wake in a private bedroom, have servants maintain fires and bring water, dress with assistants, eat food prepared by household staff, and spend portions of the day visiting, corresponding, supervising servants, arranging social obligations, participating in charitable activities, or managing children with the help of nurses and governesses. Now consider a working-class wife living only a few miles away. She might wake before sunrise in a crowded room, light the fire herself, prepare breakfast, get children ready, carry water, clean wash clothing, purchase food, perform paid work, care for a baby, prepare another meal, and continue working after. Both women were described by society as wives. Their daily experiences had almost nothing in common, except the expectations attached to marriage and womanhood. Wealth could reduce physical labor without necessarily creating freedom. Upper-class marriages carried their own forms of pressure. Family estates, inheritance, titles, social alliances, and reputation could influence whom someone was expected to marry. A wealthy woman might possess servants for every practical need, yet have little freedom in choosing the direction of her life. Her husband could spend long periods away conducting business, participating in politics, hunting, travelling, or managing property. The enormous house that looked luxurious from outside could become lonely. Privacy within wealthy households was complicated by servants. A husband and wife might have more physical space than poor couples, but they were rarely completely alone. Servants entered bedrooms, cleaned private spaces, handled clothing, delivered messages, prepared baths, served meals, and overheard conversations. Household staff often knew far more about a marriage than employers realized. They knew whether husband and wife slept separately. They knew who came home late. They knew whether breakfast was tense. They knew when someone had been crying. The architecture of respectability depended upon workers who witnessed what happened behind it. Employers therefore needed discretion from servants, while servants depended upon employers for wages and references. Domestic life was layered with relationships of power. Middle-class families often occupied an uncomfortable space between wealthy households and working families. They wanted the appearance of refinement, but might possess limited income. A family could employ one servant while expecting her to perform an enormous range of tasks. Maintaining social position required careful spending. A professional man's wife could become responsible for making a modest income look more impressive than it actually was. Dinner guests needed appropriate food. The parlour needed respectable furniture. Children required suitable education. Clothing had to communicate status. The household could not appear poor even when finances were strained. This performance could be exhausting. A wife might save aggressively in private, so the family could entertain publicly. The husband's career could depend partly on social relationships cultivated through dinners and visits. Domestic labour therefore supported professional ambition. The wife's contribution rarely appeared on his business card. Yet the polished household could help create the impression of stability upon which his reputation depended. Marriage connected private life to public success in ways difficult to measure. The same was true lower down the economic scale. A labourer's wife keeping him fed, clothed, and able to return to work every morning was participating indirectly in the economy. Without domestic labour, industrial labour could not function. Factories depended upon workers. Workers depended upon households. Households depended heavily upon women. Yet wages were usually paid only for the factory portion of that chain. The 19th century rarely calculated the economic value of the work happening before and after the paid working day. The people living inside marriages understood its necessity, even if society lacked language for valuing it. A husband returning home with torn clothing expected repairs, because replacing garments was expensive. A wife needed his wages because domestic labour did not necessarily produce cash. Each person's work made the other's possible. This mutual dependence could create partnership. It could also create power struggles. The person bringing home money could believe that earning it gave him the right to decide how it was spent. The person managing the household could believe that only she understood what the family actually needed. Both could be partly correct. Saturday night could therefore become financially important in working households where wages were paid weekly. Money arrived. Then it immediately began disappearing: rent, food, fuel, debt, clothing. Perhaps a little was saved, perhaps nothing remained. If a husband kept part of his wages for drinking or entertainment, conflict could follow. Temperance reformers built entire campaigns around the image of wives and children suffering, while wages disappeared in drinking establishments. These campaigns could be exaggerated for moral effect, but the underlying household problem was real enough to resonate with millions. A few coins could determine whether children ate adequately. Marriage made personal habits collective. Perhaps one of the strangest differences between marriage then and marriage today was how completely the household could determine a person's identity. Once married, especially within respectable communities, people were no longer viewed simply as two independent adults who happened to share a home. They became a household. Their behavior reflected upon one another. A husband's financial irresponsibility could damage his wife's reputation and security. A wife's behavior could affect how neighbors, employers, business associates, and relatives regarded her husband. Children carried the family name into schools, workplaces, churches, and eventually marriages of their own. Private choices could therefore acquire public consequences. This created pressure to protect the appearance of unity, even when unity did not exist. A couple might disagree strongly about money, children, religion, relatives, or where they should live, yet revealing those disagreements publicly could invite gossip. Respectable marriage was supposed to appear stable. Couples learned to perform stability. Imagine an argument beginning before church on Sunday morning. Perhaps the husband had spent money the family needed. Perhaps his wife had invited a relative he disliked. Voices rose inside the house. One person said something unnecessarily cruel. Another refused to answer. Then the church bell rang. The argument stopped. Clothing was adjusted. Children were gathered. The front door opened, and the family walked down the street together. Neighbours saw an ordinary, respectable household. Only the husband and wife knew that they had barely spoken for the previous hour. This separation between public appearance and private reality could become a defining feature of marriage. Social respectability required self-control. Personal frustration had to fit around obligations. There was always something that needed doing. You could be furious with your husband and still need the money he earned. You could be furious with your wife and still need her to manage the household. You could decide never to speak again at breakfast and discover by afternoon that the roof was leaking and required a joint decision. Practical life repeatedly forced communication. Perhaps this prevented some arguments from becoming permanent. Perhaps it prolonged marriages that should have ended. Both were possible. The 19th century offered fewer opportunities to construct a completely independent life after marriage, particularly for women. Once households, property, children, relatives, and income became interconnected, separating them could be extraordinarily difficult. Even when legal separation was possible, practical separation remained another matter. Where would each person live? Who would keep the furniture? Who would pay debts? Who would care for children? Would relatives take sides? Would employers find out? Could either person afford another household? Modern divorce can involve complicated answers to these questions. In the 19th century, the legal framework was often even less prepared to treat spouses as equal independent parties. For many couples, staying together was simply easier than untangling everything. That did not necessarily mean constant misery. Human beings adapt. Two people who had lost romantic affection could still become effective partners. They might cooperate around children and finances while expecting little emotional intimacy. A marriage could transform into something closer to a business partnership. In some households, This arrangement may have been perfectly acceptable. The modern expectation that one spouse should simultaneously be romantic partner, best friend, emotional confidant, co-parent, financial partner, intellectual companion, and source of personal fulfillment was not always expressed in the same way. People could seek different forms of companionship elsewhere without necessarily threatening the marriage. Men maintained close friendships with men. Women maintained deep friendships with women. Letters between friends could be intensely affectionate by modern standards. Siblings remained emotionally important throughout adulthood. A married woman might discuss certain fears with her sister rather than her husband. A man might reveal professional anxieties to a brother or close friend. Marriage was central, but it did not need to contain every emotional relationship in a person's life. Extended family often remained especially important. A married daughter did not stop being a daughter. She could return to her mother's house during childbirth. Her mother might stay with her for weeks afterward. Sisters could arrive to help with children. Brothers could assist financially. Marriage created a new household without completely replacing the old one. When families lived nearby, movement between homes could be constant. A child disappeared after breakfast and was discovered at an aunt's house by lunchtime. A grandmother arrived without formal invitation. Someone borrowed flour. Someone returned a pot. News travelled with them. The boundary around the nuclear family could be much more porous than modern ideals suggest. This network provided resilience. If a mother became ill, relatives could take children temporarily. If a husband lost work, a brother might know of employment. If rent became impossible, the family might move into a parent's house. But support came with expectations. The relative who lent money could feel entitled to opinions. The mother who provided childcare might criticize parenting. The father who helped purchase a house might believe he deserved influence over financial decisions. Help was rarely completely free. Marriage, therefore, involved diplomacy. A spouse had to manage not only the person they married, but the relationships that came attached to them. The famous tension involving in-laws existed because those relationships mattered. A husband could dislike his wife's mother, but still depend upon her assistance when a baby arrived. A wife could find her husband's sister irritating, but need her help during illness. People learned to tolerate one another, because families were systems of mutual dependence. Distance could simplify these relationships while creating loneliness. Migration separated couples from interfering relatives, but also from supportive ones. A young wife moving hundreds of miles away might initially enjoy independence. Then she became pregnant. Suddenly, the absence of her mother felt enormous. Who would explain what was happening? Who would help during recovery? Who would hold the baby while she slept? A letter could provide advice, but could not carry water. In isolated households, husbands sometimes had to participate more directly simply because no other adult was available. Necessity could quietly challenge gender conventions. A man who would never have performed certain domestic tasks in his parents' household might do them when his wife was sick and the nearest female relative lived days away. Nobody needed to debate gender ideology. The baby was crying. Something had to be done. Real life repeatedly forced people beyond prescribed roles. Women performed agricultural work when farms required it. Men cooked when circumstances required it. Children became caregivers. Grandparents became parents again. The household adapted because survival mattered more than perfect conformity. Seasonal labor created another rhythm in rural marriages. Marriage on a farm was deeply connected to the calendar. Spring brought planting and preparation. Summer brought long days of work. Harvest could require almost everyone capable of helping. Winter changed the pace, but introduced different tasks and dangers. A farmer's wife did not simply wait indoors, while her husband performed the real agricultural labor. She might manage poultry, dairy production, gardens, food preservation, meals for workers, children, sewing, laundry, and additional field work when needed. Eggs, butter, cheese, vegetables, and other products could generate income controlled partly or largely by women in some households. A small household economy operated alongside the farm's larger finances. The wife's contribution could determine whether the family possessed cash for small purchases. Farm marriage, therefore, required cooperation even when public language emphasized male ownership. Weather became almost another member of the household. Too much rain, too little rain, early frost or storm before harvest. These events could destroy months of work. A husband and wife might stand together looking at damaged crops and understand instantly what it meant: less income, fewer purchases, debts postponed, plans abandoned. Perhaps a child could no longer continue schooling. Perhaps repairs would wait another year. Nature could rewrite a family's future overnight. Urban households faced different uncertainties. Industrial employment disconnected survival from weather somewhat, but connected it to markets and machinery. A factory could reduce wages. A business could close. A machine could replace a skill. A strike could stop income. A worker could be injured. Industrialization promised opportunity while creating new forms of dependence. A husband's body itself could become the household's primary economic asset. If his strength failed, income failed. This placed enormous psychological pressure on health. A persistent cough was not merely uncomfortable. It could threaten rent. A damaged hand could threaten food. A serious accident could transform a wife into the household's primary earner almost immediately. Workers understood this vulnerability. Friendly societies, mutual aid groups, trade organizations, savings clubs, and insurance arrangements developed partly because families needed protection against catastrophe. There was another reality of 19th century marriage that rarely survives in photographs or official records. The enormous difference between what people expected before marriage and what they discovered afterward. A young person could spend years imagining married life without ever having managed a household, supported a family, raised a child, or shared every day with another adult. Expectations came from parents, religious teaching, novels, friends, older relatives, and observation of other families. But observation revealed only what happened publicly. Children could grow up believing their parents had a peaceful marriage without knowing what was discussed after the bedroom door closed. A young woman could admire an older married couple at church without knowing that they had nearly separated 20 years earlier. A young man could believe his father naturally understood money without realizing how many mistakes had been quietly corrected by his mother. People entered marriage carrying assumptions inherited from households whose private realities they only partly understood. A bride could imagine that competence would arrive with the wedding ring, Instead, she woke the following morning as essentially the same person she had been before the ceremony, except that expectations had changed around her. If she had been trained extensively in household management, the transition might be relatively smooth. If she had grown up with servants or a mother who handled most responsibilities, managing a household could be intimidating. Suddenly, there were decisions everywhere. What should be purchased? How much could be spent? When should washing be done? How much fuel would be needed? Which foods would keep? How should unexpected visitors be entertained? What should happen when a servant failed to appear? A stove malfunctioned or a child became sick. Experience arrived through mistakes. Bread burned, milk spoiled, money ran short, fabric shrank, a meal failed, something valuable was broken, the young wife learned. The young husband was learning too, though his mistakes appeared elsewhere. Perhaps he underestimated rent. Perhaps he believed his wages would stretch further than they did. Perhaps he borrowed money to furnish the household more comfortably and discovered that debt followed him for years. Perhaps he assumed advancement at work would happen quickly. Then months passed. His income remained the same. Meanwhile, the family grew. Marriage forced both people to confront the difference between imagined adulthood and actual adulthood. There was no moment when uncertainty disappeared. Older couples simply became better at hiding it. A husband of 40 might appear completely confident to his children, while privately asking his wife whether they could survive another poor year. A mother of 6 might appear to know everything about children, while still becoming frightened when the youngest developed an unfamiliar fever. Competence was often accumulated fear that had been survived before. The first child had been terrifying. By the 4th, parents recognized certain problems. But no 2 children were identical. One slept easily, another cried constantly. One was healthy, another seemed to catch every illness. One obeyed, another challenged everything. Parents adapted again. Children also changed the relationship between husband and wife in ways nobody could completely predict before marriage. Before children, the couple could focus largely upon each other. After a birth, the household acquired a new center. The baby did not negotiate. Its needs were immediate. A husband could suddenly feel ignored because his wife's attention was consumed by nursing and care. A wife could feel abandoned if her husband continued his outside routines while her entire life changed around the infant. Neither feeling required either person to be selfish. They were adapting to a dramatic redistribution of time. Sleep disappeared first. A newborn did not understand the working day. The husband might need to rise early for employment. The wife might already have been awake repeatedly through the night. Both were tired. Who deserved rest more? There was no satisfactory answer. In wealthier households, nurses and servants could absorb part of the burden. For ordinary families, exhaustion remained inside the marriage. A wife might sleep lightly because she expected to hear the child first. A husband could sleep through crying and genuinely not understand why his wife was angry in the morning. Some domestic disagreements are probably timeless. But 19th century mothers carried additional physical burdens. Breastfeeding could continue while another pregnancy approached. There were no guaranteed maternity protections from household work. A woman might return to demanding tasks shortly after childbirth because food still had to be prepared and older children still required care. Female relatives could make an enormous difference. A mother arriving after a birth brought experience. practical labor, and reassurance. She could take over cooking, hold the baby, wash clothing, explain which symptoms were ordinary, tell her exhausted daughter to sleep. Where such support existed, childbirth belonged to a community of women rather than to the couple alone. Where it did not, husband and wife faced the transition with fewer resources. The husband's involvement depended heavily on personality, culture, class, and circumstance. Some fathers kept their distance from infant care because gender expectations encouraged it. Others became involved whenever necessary. Private life was flexible in ways public ideals were not. A man could believe firmly that childcare belonged primarily to women and still spend an entire night walking around a room with a crying baby because his wife was too exhausted to continue. Necessity has always been more persuasive than theory. As children grew, another question entered the marriage: what kind of adults were they supposed to become? Parents could disagree deeply. A father might value discipline and practical employment. A mother might value education. One parent could be religiously strict, the other more forgiving. One might punish quickly, the other secretly comfort the child afterward. Children learned these differences. They knew which parent to approach for money, which parent might allow an outing, which parent was more likely to believe an excuse. The household became a small political system. Children negotiated within it expertly. Parents sometimes. Then another argument began. Why did you tell him he could go? I thought you had already agreed. I said no yesterday. He told me you said yes. Some things required no electricity to become complicated. Adolescence could be especially difficult because children began forming identities beyond parental control. A daughter developed friendships her parents did not fully know. A son earned his own wages and suddenly possessed money that did not come directly from his father. Young adults began attending dances, workplaces, churches, shops, and social gatherings without constant supervision. Then romance appeared. The parents who had once been young lovers themselves suddenly became suspicious guardians. They evaluated every visitor. What does he do for work? Who are his parents? Does he have debts? Why is he here again? A mother could notice her daughter's interest before the daughter admitted anything. A father could pretend not to notice until the young man formally approached him. Courtship entered the household. Suddenly the marriage of the parents influenced the marriage of the next generation. Children learned what husbands and wives were supposed to be partly by watching their own parents. A daughter who watched her father treat her mother respectfully might expect similar treatment. A son who watched his mother manage money carefully might seek competence in a future wife. Unfortunately, harmful patterns could also repeat. Children raised around violence or domination could absorb those behaviors as normal. Marriage reproduced culture inside the home. This made parental example powerful, even when parents never deliberately taught anything. Children watched who spoke at dinner, who made decisions, who apologized after arguments, who handled money, who performed which work. They noticed whether their father thanked their mother. They noticed whether their mother feared their father. The household was their first education in adult relationships. Then they carried those lessons into their own marriages. Generations became connected through habits nobody consciously chose. Some people resisted what they had witnessed. A man who remembered a violent father could deliberately promise himself never to behave similarly. A woman who watched her mother live without financial knowledge could insist upon understanding household accounts. Change could begin quietly inside one marriage. Not every reform required a law. Sometimes it began when someone decided, "My household will be different." Laws still mattered enormously because private intentions existed inside public structures. A generous husband could voluntarily treat his wife as an equal partner. But her security remained vulnerable. If legal rules did not recognize her independence, what happened if he died? What happened if his personality changed? What happened if creditors appeared? Rights based entirely upon another person's goodwill were fragile. This is why married women's property reforms became so significant. They were not merely abstract legal developments. They affected who controlled wages, who owned property, who could protect assets, and what options a woman possessed if the marriage became unstable. And those unrecorded mournings could begin very differently, depending on where a couple lived. In a crowded industrial neighborhood, the first sounds might be carts moving through narrow streets, factory whistles, footsteps on staircases, neighbors speaking through thin walls, and workers preparing to leave before daylight. In the countryside, mourning might begin with animals, wind, rain against a window, or the sound of someone moving through the kitchen to restart the fire. Wealthier households could wake to servants already working elsewhere in the building. Poorer husbands and wives were often the servants of their own needs. Before either had time to think about whether married life was happy, disappointing, romantic, or restrictive, there was work waiting. That practical urgency shaped relationships. Modern discussions about marriage often focus heavily on emotional satisfaction. 19th century couples certainly cared about affection, but many had little opportunity to spend hours analyzing the relationship itself. Survival generated its own schedule. If the family needed food, someone worked. If the roof leaked, someone repaired it or found someone who could. If a child was sick, someone stayed awake. If rent was due, money had to be. Marriage could become less a continuous conversation about happiness and more a continuous sequence of problems solved together. This could make affection appear unusually practical. A husband might demonstrate love by repairing his wife's worn shoes rather than telling her how deeply he appreciated her. A wife might express affection by saving the best portion of a meal for her husband after a difficult working day. He noticed that she was cold and moved her chair closer to the fire. She noticed that his coat was wearing thin and quietly reinforced the fabric before it tore. Neither action would have sounded dramatic in a love letter, but repeated for 30 years, they became a language of their own. The meaning of generosity was also different when households possessed less. Giving someone the larger portion mattered when food was limited. Buying a small gift mattered when every coin had another possible use. Taking a day away from paid work to care for a spouse could carry an actual financial cost. Sacrifice was measurable. A wife might know that the piece of fruit her husband brought home had been purchased with money he could have spent on himself. A husband might understand that the new shirt his wife made represented hours taken from other work. Objects carried labor inside them. This made possessions emotionally significant. A wedding gift could remain in use for decades. A chipped cup might be kept because it had belonged to a mother. A husband's watch could eventually pass to a son. A wife's jewelry could become a daughter's inheritance. Marriage gradually filled a home with objects whose value could not be understood from their price. The household itself became a physical biography. A newly married couple might begin with almost empty rooms. Years later, every corner contained something acquired during the marriage. The cradle used for several children, the chair purchased after a better year financially, the clock given by relatives, the table marked by countless meals, the photograph taken when the eldest child married, a house aged alongside the people inside it. Walls were repainted. Furniture was repaired. Rooms changed purposes. A nursery became a child's bedroom, then perhaps a guest room after the children left. The architecture recorded family transitions. Moving disrupted this accumulated memory. Sometimes couples moved willingly toward opportunity. Other moves were forced by rent, employment, eviction, inheritance, or disaster. Packing a 19th century household was not trivial. Furniture was valuable. Transportation could be expensive. Possessions had to be selected carefully. What could be carried? What should be sold? What could be left with relatives? A move exposed priorities. Sentimental objects competed with practical ones. A heavy table might be useful but difficult to transport. A bundle of letters weighed almost nothing and could contain 20 years of emotional history. People chose. Then they began again. Migration across an ocean made these choices even more severe. A couple leaving Europe for North America, for example, could not simply transport everything they owned without cost and difficulty. They carried what mattered most or what would be most useful: clothing, tools, documents, perhaps family photographs, perhaps a Bible, perhaps letters, perhaps a small object from home that served no practical purpose at all. That useless object might become the most precious thing they owned. 20 years later, migration also transformed the marriage, because the couple could become each other's strongest connection to the world they had left. They shared memories of streets their children had never seen. They remembered relatives whose voices the children did not know. They spoke about foods, customs, landscapes, and celebrations from somewhere far away. Their marriage contained a private geography. A word or song could bring the old home back for a moment. Children raised in the new country might not completely understand why their parents became emotional. The husband and wife understood. They had been there together. Shared memory gave marriage a form of intimacy that developed only through time. This was true even for couples who never migrated. Every long marriage gradually accumulated references incomprehensible to outsiders. A sentence could refer to an event 20 years earlier. A glance across a dinner table could communicate an opinion about a relative without a word being spoken. Children might notice their parents laughing and have no idea why. The couple had developed a private language. Sometimes this familiarity was affectionate. Sometimes it became irritating. Knowing another person extremely well meant knowing exactly how they would react. A husband began telling a story, and his wife already knew the ending because she had heard it 50 times. She corrected one detail. He insisted his version was correct. The children laughed because the argument happened every time. Eventually, even the disagreement became part of the story. Repetition could produce comfort. It could also produce boredom. Not every 19th century spouse was satisfied with domestic routine. Some people felt trapped by predictability. A young woman who had imagined adventure could discover that marriage narrowed her world to the same rooms and responsibilities. A man who had imagined independence could discover that every financial decision now involved dependence. Marriage required surrendering possibilities Choosing one life meant not choosing others. That truth could become painful during moments of dissatisfaction. A wife might wonder what would have happened if she had remained unmarried and pursued employment or education. A husband might wonder what would have happened if he had emigrated alone rather than establishing a family. Such thoughts did not necessarily mean they hated their spouses. People can love the life they possess and still imagine lives they did not choose. 19th century culture provided limited respectable space for admitting such ambivalence, particularly for women. Marriage and motherhood were often presented as natural fulfillment. A woman who felt bored, intellectually frustrated, or overwhelmed could interpret those feelings as personal failure. She was supposed to be grateful. Her household might be comfortable. Her husband might be decent. Her children might be healthy. Why then was she unhappy? That question appeared in diaries, fiction, reform writing, and eventually political movements. Domestic security was not identical to personal freedom. For some women, the realization came slowly. They wanted access to education, control over property, meaningful work, a voice in political life, the ability to make decisions without legal dependence upon a husband. These demands did not always represent rejection of marriage. Many reformers were married. They argued that affection should not require legal inequality. A woman could love her husband and still believe the law treated her unfairly. A husband could support his wife's rights without believing marriage itself should disappear. This distinction became increasingly important as the century progressed. The idea of marriage as partnership began competing more openly with the idea of marriage as hierarchy. The transition was incomplete and uneven. Even couples who believed in partnership had inherited habits from a hierarchical society. A progressive husband could support women's education while still expecting dinner to appear on time. A wife could advocate greater independence while accepting that household work remained primarily her responsibility. Social change rarely arrives cleanly. Old expectations survive inside new beliefs. Marriage became one of the places where these contradictions were lived rather than merely debated. Who should make the final decision? Who should control earnings? Should a married woman work outside the home if the family did not financially need it? Could a husband object? What happened when a wife's work became more successful than expected? These questions grew more visible toward the end of the century. Working class families had always needed women's labor in many forms, but middle-class ideology treated women's paid employment differently. For a middle-class husband, having a wife who needed to work could sometimes imply that he could not provide adequately. Her employment therefore touched his social identity. There were also moments in 19th century marriage when the ordinary structure of the household was interrupted by something as simple as a visitor arriving at the door. Hospitality carried social meaning, and a married couple could be judged by how their home received other people. Among families with enough resources, visitors might be invited into a parlour carefully maintained for precisely this purpose. The best furniture, decorative objects, family photographs, books, and other signs of respectability were displayed there. A visitor entering that room was not necessarily seeing the household as it normally existed. They were seeing the version of the household the family wanted the outside world to see. Behind the parlour could be unfinished washing, noisy children, financial worries, and a kitchen far less elegant than the room prepared for guests. The distinction between public and private space was meaningful. A wife could spend considerable effort maintaining the visible face of the household, because her husband's social position and her own reputation were connected to it. Even families with limited money sometimes saved their best possessions for special occasions. The finest dishes were not necessarily used every day. Better clothing remained stored until Sunday or a visit. A particular tablecloth appeared. When company arrived, hospitality became a small performance of stability. Unexpected visitors disrupted that performance. Someone knocked. The household had seconds to transform. Children were told to behave. Objects were moved. A wife quickly assessed whether there was enough food or drink to offer. The husband greeted the visitor as though nothing unusual had happened. If the couple had been arguing moments earlier, the argument disappeared behind polite conversation. When the visitor finally left, the door closed. The marriage resumed exactly where it had stopped. This ability to move between public politeness and private reality was part of respectable adulthood. Letters demanded a similar performance. A married couple might write to relatives describing the household as healthy and comfortable, even while privately struggling. People did not necessarily want distant parents worrying. Pride mattered. A husband did not always want his father-in-law knowing that money was short. A wife might avoid telling her mother that marriage was more difficult than expected because she did not want to hear, "I warned you." So letters could contain selective truth. The children are well. Busyness is improving. We are quite comfortable. Perhaps the children had only just recovered from illness. Perhaps business was barely surviving. Perhaps the household was anything but comfortable. Historical letters therefore need to be read carefully. Silence does not always mean absence. People concealed things from paper just as they conceal things from conversation. Diaries could be more revealing, but even diaries were not always completely honest. People wrote what they could admit to themselves. A wife might describe feeling tired rather than writing that she resented her husband. A husband could complain about work rather than admit he feared failure. Emotional vocabulary was shaped by culture still. Fragments occasionally break through. A sentence about missing someone. A complaint that a husband has not written, a note about sitting beside a sick wife, a description of a child's death. Suddenly, the formal 19th century voice disappears, and an ordinary human being becomes visible. Marriage was full of these emotional moments, but much of the time, emotion remained embedded in practical language. A husband travelling might write instructions about repairing a fence, and then add one sentence telling his wife how much he missed her. A wife might spend an entire letter discussing children and household expenses before ending with a request that he return as soon as possible. The affection is almost hidden inside administration. That was appropriate because administration itself was part of affection. Managing another person's affairs meant their life mattered to you. When husbands travelled for extended periods, wives could assume responsibilities usually associated with men. They handled business correspondence, paid bills, negotiated with tradesmen, supervised farms, dealt with tenants, or made decisions that supposedly belonged to the absent husband. Distance revealed how flexible gender roles could become when necessary. A capable wife might run everything successfully for months. Then the husband returned. What happened to the authority she had exercised? Sometimes she surrendered it without conflict. Sometimes both recognized her competence and the marriage became more collaborative. Sometimes the husband felt threatened. Authority could be easier to discuss in theory than after someone else had demonstrated they could perform your role perfectly well. Wars created this problem on a massive scale. Men left. Women managed households and businesses. Then men returned, expecting familiar arrangements. The family they returned to had changed. Children had grown accustomed to their mother's decisions. The wife had learned to act independently. The husband had been changed by experiences away from home. Reunion could therefore contain joy and tension simultaneously. Everyone had imagined the moment of return. Nobody had imagined the months of adjustment afterward. A husband could feel strangely unnecessary inside his own home. A wife could resent surrendering freedoms she had acquired through necessity. Neither emotion meant they did not love each other. Marriage had simply changed while they were apart. Long separations could also produce idealized images. A wife reading affectionate letters could remember her absent husband at his best. A husband far away could imagine home as a perfect place of comfort. Then he returned and discovered crying children, expenses, chores, and the ordinary irritations he had forgotten. She discovered that the heroic figure in the letters still left things in inconvenient places. Reality returned with him. This could be comforting. Ordinary flaws meant the separation was truly over. Travail itself became a recurring part of some marriages. Sailors, soldiers, merchants, railway workers, travelling salesmen, politicians, and others could spend long periods away. Their wives effectively moved between marriage and temporary single management of the household. The rhythm was departure, waiting, return, adjustment, departure again. Children sometimes knew fathers partly through stories. A baby could become a walking toddler between a man's departure and return. The father entered the house expecting the infant he remembered. The child saw a stranger. That moment could be painful. The mother became the bridge. This is Papa. Recognition had to be rebuilt. Then perhaps he left again. Marriage under these conditions required enormous trust. Infidelity was one fear, death was another. A ship could disappear. A military unit could be destroyed. A traveller could become sick far from home. News could take weeks. The spouse waiting at home occupied an uncomfortable space between marriage and potential widowhood whenever information stopped. People sometimes received incorrect reports. A husband believed dead could return. A wife could spend months mourning someone who was alive. Such stories sound melodramatic because modern communication has made them rare. But 19th century distance created genuine informational uncertainty. Even ordinary employment could carry danger. A miner's wife knew that accidents happened underground. A railway worker's wife knew trains killed employees. A sailor's wife knew storms did not care about family plans. A factory worker's wife knew machinery could destroy a hand or arm in seconds. When the husband was late, imagination filled the silence. Most evenings he eventually appeared. That repetition built confidence. The familiar sound at the door meant another day had ended safely. Perhaps this made homecoming emotionally significant, even when nobody treated it ceremonially. A coat was removed, boots were cleaned. Someone asked about the day. Food was served. The worker transformed back into husband and father. The household absorbed him. Work could follow him home emotionally, however. A humiliating encounter with an employer could become irritability at dinner. A dispute with another worker could occupy his thoughts. A wife might recognize immediately that something had happened. What is wrong? Nothing. The oldest unhelpful answer in marriage probably has a long history. Eventually he might explain or not. Women carried their own frustrations into evening. A child had behaved badly. A neighbour had insulted her. Something had broken. Money had run short. She had been working since morning. Her husband arrived wanting peace. She wanted someone to listen. Neither request was unreasonable. Both could be incompatible for the first half hour. This small collision between outside work and domestic work repeated across households. Marriage joined 2 exhausting days at the dinner table. If there was enough patience, the evening recovered. If not, 1 bad mood could become 2. Then children sensed tension. The emotional atmosphere of a household affected everyone living inside it. Children learned when not to ask questions. Servants knew when employers were arguing. Neighbours noticed slammed doors. Privacy was imperfect. Sound travelled. A married couple living in crowded housing could have almost no acoustic privacy. An argument whispered at night might still be heard through a wall. This could encourage restraint, or simply create gossip. Communities knew which couples fought frequently.